Russian officials are insisting control was never lost, that the threat was neutralized swiftly, that security functioned as designed, but notice the contradiction embedded in that message, because if everything worked perfectly, the story would never have been told at all, and the decision to go public suggests an internal need to signal something else, perhaps deterrence, perhaps loyalty tests, perhaps a warning to rivals inside the system as much as enemies outside it. The significance of the Kremlin confirming a credible assassination threat against Vladimir Putin lies less in details they chose to release and more in the fact that they chose to say anything at all, because this is a system that survives on silence around vulnerability, especially at the very top, and when Russian authorities publicly acknowledge that a threat reached the level of the president, they are breaking one of their own most carefully guarded rules, signaling that something occurred serious enough that denial was no longer the safest option, and that calculation alone reshapes how this moment should be understood. In modern Russian governance, the image of Putin as untouchable is not just symbolic, it is structural. It stabilizes elite behavior, discourages internal rivalry, and reinforces the idea that power flows in one direction and cannot be interrupted. So when officials confirm a threat, even while insisting it was neutralized, they implicitly admit that the protective bubble around the presidency is not absolute, and that admission carries consequences far beyond the immediate security incident. The wording used by the Kremlin has been deliberate and narrow, emphasizing control, speed, and effectiveness, but experienced observers recognize that confirmation itself is a form of damage control, because truly inconsequential threats are buried, not announced, and by acknowledging this, the state appears to be responding to pressures we cannot fully see. Whether internal rumors, elite anxiety, or intelligence leaks that made silence riskier than disclosure. In authoritarian systems, credibility is maintained by managing perception, and here the perception being managed is not public fear alone, but elite confidence, because those closest to power understand how rare such confirmations are and what they imply about stress inside the system. Historically, moments when threats to Russian leaders become visible often coincide with periods of transition, war strain, or internal competition. And while the Kremlin is careful to frame this incident as isolated, the broader context matters: a prolonged war, sanctions pressure, shifting loyalties, and growing security burdens all increase the weight placed on the protective apparatus surrounding the president. Confirmation also serves a warning function, signaling to potential internal challengers that the state is alert and willing to respond harshly, while simultaneously reminding loyalists that danger exists and unity is required. A dual message that reinforces control through fear as much as reassurance. Yet this strategy has limits, because once vulnerability is acknowledged, it cannot be fully erased, and elites begin recalculating risk in quieter ways, adjusting their behavior, securing their positions, and watching one another more closely, which can subtly alter internal dynamics over time. Internationally, the confirmation shifts analysis from speculation to structural concern, because threats against a sitting Russian president raise questions about command continuity, escalation control, and crisis stability, especially during an active conflict, and foreign governments now have to factor in not just Putin's decisions, but the pressures acting upon him. What makes this moment particularly revealing is that it exposes the tension between projection and reality inside the Kremlin, the need to appear invulnerable while confronting the fact that no system under sustained stress remains perfectly sealed, and by confirming the threat, Russian authorities have unintentionally pulled back the curtain just enough to show that even at the highest level, control is something that must be constantly defended, not assumed, and that realization may prove more consequential than the incident itself. The rare public admission by the Kremlin that a credible assassination threat targeted Vladimir Putin carries implications far beyond the immediate security incident, because in a system built on secrecy and the projection of invulnerability, any acknowledgement of vulnerability is inherently destabilizing, and when that vulnerability is acknowledged at the very top of the hierarchy, it reverberates throughout the entire power structure, signaling to allies, subordinates, and rivals that even the most protected figure is not beyond reach, a notion that challenges long-standing assumptions and forces recalibration of behavior at every level of governance and military command. In Russia, the image of Putin as untouchable is not merely symbolic. It is a functional pillar of authority, the foundation on which loyalty, obedience, and elite cohesion are maintained. And when that image cracks even slightly, it triggers both overt and covert reactions among those who have built their own positions on the belief that the center of power is secure and that any disruption is unlikely to penetrate the inner sanctum. The announcement itself, carefully phrased to emphasize control, rapid response, and the neutralization of the threat, is a form of messaging designed to reassure, but it simultaneously acknowledges the existence of danger, and in a system where silence around threats is the norm, the very act of speaking signals that something extraordinary occurred, something that could not be contained by normal protocols or internal suppression, and that has immediate implications for perceptions of stability and competence. By making the threat public, the Kremlin also communicates a warning to potential internal adversaries, a reminder that while the leadership is aware of vulnerabilities, it is also capable of swift and decisive action. A message intended to deter internal dissent and reinforce discipline among elites, but at the same time it introduces a subtle uncertainty into the hierarchy, because insiders now know that the protective apparatus, while effective, is not invincible, and that even high-level security can be tested, a revelation that changes how risk is assessed and how loyalty is performed. The psychological effects of this confirmation are manifold, as security officials, regional governors, military commanders, and political operatives all must recalibrate their understanding of risk, personal responsibility, and situational awareness, knowing that the system they serve is capable of being breached and that they are one step removed from potential exposure themselves, a realization that can lead to heightened caution, overcompensation, or even internal maneuvering as individuals seek to protect their own positions in light of perceived fragility at the top. Beyond internal dynamics, the public acknowledgement also has strategic consequences for Russia's international posture, because it signals to foreign governments, intelligence agencies, and military planners that the Russian state, for all its resources and defensive measures, is not impervious, and that high-value targets, even the head of state, are vulnerable to sophisticated operations, an admission that can embolden adversaries or influence the calculation of risk in ongoing conflicts, particularly in the context of the war in Ukraine, where pressure on Russian leadership is already intense. Furthermore, the timing of the confirmation is critical, as it occurs against a backdrop of ongoing military engagements, economic sanctions, and political tension, all of which exacerbate the potential impact of perceived vulnerability, because when leaders are under multiple simultaneous pressures, even minor disruptions or threats can have outsized effects on decision-making, perception management, and operational priorities, forcing the Kremlin to allocate attention, resources, and messaging in ways that may not align with traditional strategic planning. Analysts note that the acknowledgement serves multiple functions, reassuring domestic audiences that security protocols work, signaling to elites that the leadership remains vigilant, and communicating to adversaries that breaches, while possible, will be addressed decisively, a complex balancing act that underscores the fragility of credibility when transparency intersects with threat exposure. Historically, moments when Russian leaders face publicly acknowledged threats often coincide with shifts in internal power dynamics, because the perception of vulnerability allows actors within the system to reassess influence, alliances, and loyalty. And when the head of state is portrayed as temporarily exposed, it catalyzes conversations, both overt and covert, about succession planning, contingency measures, and the reliability of security institutions, considerations that otherwise remain latent until activated by crisis. The international community, too, must grapple with the implications of this revelation, because an attempted strike against the president raises immediate questions about continuity of governance, escalation risk, and the stability of command structures, especially in a country with a centralized, authoritarian decision-making model, and the ripple effects extend to allies, adversaries, and neutral observers who monitor leadership resilience as a key variable in geopolitical forecasting. In practical terms, the Kremlin's response to the confirmed threat has included tightening security measures, adjusting public appearances, and signaling readiness through controlled narratives, steps designed to reassert control while containing the perception of weakness. Yet even these measures carry symbolic weight, demonstrating to insiders and outsiders alike that the leadership is both aware of danger and capable of responding. A delicate dance between transparency, deterrence, and perception management. At the same time, the very existence of a confirmed assassination attempt invites speculation about the mechanisms that allowed the threat to reach the president, raising questions about intelligence penetration, operational security, and potential lapses in protective infrastructure, issues that are rarely discussed openly, but which have profound implications for risk assessment, internal trust, and the future allocation of resources within the Russian state apparatus. Ultimately, the Kremlin's rare acknowledgement of the assassination attempt illuminates the tension between the image of invulnerability and the reality of vulnerability, between controlled perception and operational risk, and between public messaging and internal recalibration, and it demonstrates that in a system that relies heavily on projection of power, the mere act of confirming a threat reshapes both the psychological landscape and the practical dynamics of leadership, setting in motion adjustments, reassessments, and strategic calculations that will continue to influence Russian governance, elite behavior, and international perception for months to come. The sudden confirmation of an assassination attempt against Vladimir Putin has sent shockwaves not only through Russia's security apparatus, but also through the entire structure of political authority. Because when a system built on secrecy and absolute control publicly acknowledges a credible threat against its leader, it exposes vulnerabilities that are usually invisible to both domestic and international observers, and that exposure has profound implications for decision making, elite behavior, and the perception of stability, both inside and outside the country, and it forces a re-examination of what control means in a state that relies heavily on the projection of invulnerability. In Russia, the persona of Putin as untouchable has been a cornerstone of governance, a psychological and practical tool that ensures loyalty, deters internal competition, and shapes behavior among subordinates and regional leaders. And when that persona is challenged or even momentarily shaken by the confirmation of a threat, it creates ripples throughout the system, triggering both overt responses, like increased security measures, and subtle recalibrations in the conduct and strategy of those within the inner circle, as they reassess the reliability of the protective mechanisms and stability of command. The public nature of the confirmation is particularly striking because in authoritarian systems, threats to the head of state are almost always suppressed in communication, kept hidden to maintain the aura of invincibility, and the decision to go public implies either that containment was insufficient or that signaling was necessary, or perhaps both, reflecting a calculated choice to manage perception while acknowledging reality, and that choice itself is an indicator of stress within the leadership structure. Analysts note that this act of acknowledgement is a double-edged sword. It reassures some by demonstrating that the security services are alert and capable of neutralizing threats. Yet it also amplifies awareness that the leader is not impervious, planting seeds of uncertainty that can influence the behavior of elites who are already operating in an environment of high stakes, suspicion, and competitive loyalty, and that awareness can subtly shift decision making, leading to more cautious, rigid, or self-protective actions by those closest to power. The confirmation also carries immediate implications for internal security dynamics because it exposes the fact that protective systems, whether technological, human, or procedural, can be challenged, and that realization creates both pressure and anxiety among those responsible for the safety of the president, potentially affecting morale, vigilance, and the allocation of resources, and it may prompt rapid structural or procedural adjustments that alter how security operates at every level. Beyond the security and political consequences, there is a significant psychological impact on the broader state apparatus, because once vulnerability is acknowledged, the perception of risk begins to influence not only elites but also mid-level managers, advisors, and operators who must navigate a system where the stakes have been freshly highlighted, and those ripples extend into strategic planning, operational priorities, and messaging, reinforcing the idea that in a highly centralized system, even small disruptions at the top can cascade throughout the organization. Internationally, the acknowledgement has drawn immediate attention from intelligence agencies, governments, and analysts, because a confirmed attempt on the Russian president raises questions about command continuity, crisis stability, and the reliability of decision-making structures, especially in the context of ongoing military engagements and geopolitical tension. And it forces external actors to reassess assumptions about risk, escalation potential, and the resilience of Russian leadership under pressure. The incident also has implications for Putin's public image because appearances, messaging, and symbolic displays of authority are integral to maintaining the perception of strength, and any public or semi-public evidence of vulnerability challenges the carefully curated image that underpins his authority, necessitating adjustments in public engagement, visibility, and communication to restore confidence and reinforce control, while simultaneously managing the narrative to prevent speculation from undermining credibility. Within the elite circle, the event acts as both a warning and a test. It signals that threats can penetrate protective layers, even if temporarily, and it measures the responsiveness, loyalty, and discipline of those entrusted with security and governance, creating an environment where risk assessment and self-preservation become intertwined with duty, and where calculated decisions must balance personal survival, political advantage, and institutional responsibility. The timing of the confirmation is also relevant, as it occurs amidst ongoing conflict, economic sanctions, and domestic pressures, which collectively heighten the potential impact of perceived vulnerability, because when a leader is under simultaneous stress from multiple fronts, even minor threats can magnify uncertainty, disrupt planning, and compel defensive or reactive measures that may not align with longer-term strategy, effectively compressing the time and options available to decision makers and amplifying the consequences of every choice. Strategically, the acknowledgement functions on multiple levels. It reassures domestic and international audiences that the threat was neutralized. It reinforces the image of vigilance and control, and it communicates to both internal and external actors that the leadership remains aware, responsive, and capable of managing crises, yet each of these messages must be carefully calibrated to avoid unintentionally signaling weakness, and the balancing act underscores the fragility of perception in authoritarian systems where control is as much about belief as it is about reality. The operational implications extend into planning, intelligence, and resource allocation, because a confirmed threat highlights gaps, prompts audits, and necessitates contingency planning, all of which consume attention and energy that could otherwise be devoted to policy, military strategy, or governance, and that diversion represents a subtle but significant cost, revealing how vulnerability, once perceived, reshapes priorities at multiple levels. The incident may also alter dynamics among regional leaders and power brokers as they observe how the central authority responds, gauge their own security, and adjust alliances or behavior accordingly, creating a ripple effect that can influence decision-making across the Federation, including shifts in resource distribution, loyalty signaling, and internal monitoring. And those effects often manifest quietly but persistently over time. Ultimately, the confirmation of an assassination attempt on Putin exposes the tension between projected invulnerability and operational reality, revealing the interplay of perception, control, and risk management that defines the functioning of Russian governance, and it demonstrates how even a single incident, when acknowledged, can reshape political calculations, elite behavior, strategic planning, and international perception, establishing a new context in which every action, message, and decision must be considered through the lens of vulnerability, control, and the potential cascading consequences throughout the system.